So I will now dive into some of the issues we have. This slide here shows a satellite image. It's one of my favorite slides. Satellite image of California. You see the Sierra Nevada on the one side, the coastal mountain range on the other side of the Great Central Valley. And this is the Great Central Valley here. And what you see is some milky white. And this milky white is smog. And this milky white smog is a significant health problem. California has two of the nation's worst air quality airsheds. The number one is the San Joaquin Valley with Fresno, and the number two is Los Angeles. The number three in the United States is Houston, Texas. So a colleague of mine said, well, if it is the mountain ranges that trap the bad air, and that colleague was from Texas, by the way, said, why don't you just nuke a part of the Sierra Nevada and have an outlet? Well, that's what they do in Texas. We don't do that in California. So this is San Francisco here, this is Los Angeles here, and this is Fresno. So all the different sources of air pollution that generate air pollution in the state, or all the pollution that comes in from the outside, let's say from the ocean or from China or so, gets into the valley and it's trapped there for a prolonged period of time. So therefore, there's a lot of public pressure on all those sources that contribute to poor air. And if you have been to the San Joaquin Valley, to this area where we house 20% of the U.S. dairy cows, you will know that there are a lot of cows. So if there's poor air, a lot of cows, and not very much else, then people associate the one with the other. And there's a lot of public pressure on our dairies to address the issue of air quality. I can assure you that. When I came to California in 2002, I'm a native from Germany. I stayed in Texas, West Texas for 5 years with my PhD and then came to California in 2002. When I did so, I saw newspaper articles blaming cows as the number one source of air pollution in the state of California. The number one source of air pollution in the state of California. I saw locations like this, where you have a dairy on the one side of the fence, then a fence, and on the other side of the fence you have 1,000 households. And these people moved there recently. This dairy was there 50 years, and these people moved there, and guess what they did? First thing they did. They sued the dairy operation. So you have 1,000 voters here, and you have one voter and his cows over there. Guess who wins? And guess who is pointing fingers where? And who is not noticing that once you point a finger, 3 fingers point back at you? Think about this dairy being replaced by 1,000 homes. What kind of land use do you think would have greater environmental impact? 1,000 homes with 2,000 cars, lawnmowers, leaf blowers, people visiting their aunt and uncle in Iowa twice a year, on the one hand, or the 1,000 cars on the other side of the fence. Yet this is where the power is, and not this. I love to show this photo to people, particularly outside of California, because they cannot believe this. This is happening all over the state. When I came to the state, I saw this emission inventory, and I apologize for the small font, and you might not see it very well, but I explain it to you. When I came to the state, I saw this official emission inventory, which shows the top 25 emission sources causing smog. Those particular group of gases is called volatile organic compounds, VOCs. The number one source of VOCs in the San Joaquin Valley, according to this official emission inventory, the number one source was dairy cows. Number 2, trucks. Number 3, cars. And then come all different kinds of other sources. Down here we also see other livestock. Number 18 is broilers. Number 20 is range cattle. Number 23 is feedlot cattle. So I looked at this emission inventory, which said the number one source of smog-forming gases in the state of California, in the San Joaquin Valley, is dairy cows. Who believes that dairy cows produce more smog than cars and trucks? Nobody. Okay. Wow. This must be an egg-friendly audience here. Because normally I do see hands. So, as a result of that emission inventory and this regulatory pressure, we saw the media going berserk with the Sacramento Bee, our capital newspaper, having little comics like that. Or the Fresno Bee saying cows rival cars as smog producers. It went on and on. The media reported all the time that it's the dairies that cause poor air in California, particularly in the San Joaquin Valley. So I wanted to know, of course, as a scientist, How in the world did they come up with an emission inventory that lists cows as number one smog source in the San Joaquin Valley? And I investigated this issue together with my team, and I found out how they came up with that. Let me first show you what a California dairy looks like. This is where the dry cows are housed in dry lot corrals, dirt-floored corrals. Pretty typical. The lactating cows are housed in freestall barns where the manure that falls off the cow is flushed into the lagoon, which you see here, where the manure is highly diluted in water. So because of this emission inventory listing dairies as number one, and the belief of the regulatory agencies that this is the culprit, the lagoon, the main agency regulating air quality in the San Joaquin Valley wanted to make it mandatory for all dairies to cap the lagoon. So at the time we had 2,000 dairies, now we have 1,600. 2,000 dairies with a covered lagoon at a price per lagoon of between $1 million and $2 million would have been a considerable price tag for the dairy industry. So what we wanted to know was, first of all, is the dairy industry really the number one source of these gases? Secondly, what are the sources of these air pollutants on dairies? And what are the main sources? What do we really need to look at and mitigate? And that's what I will share with you now. So this is what a covered lagoon looks like, where you cover the entire thing and you capture the methane gas and then you burn the methane gas. So that's what they wanted to make mandatory 5 years ago for all California dairies. When we looked at what are the data underlying it, there were none, at least not for me as a scientist to see. And so I wanted to know, how did they come up with this emission inventory with the top 25 sources? And I identified the source. I went to the top agency and I asked them, where did you come up with the number one source being dairies and then all these other agricultural sources? And this was presented to me. This is a book, and again in the back you will not see it, probably not even in the front, but it's a book written by Ritzman and Benedict, Nutritional Physiology of the Adult Ruminant, written in 1938. In 1938, this is the source of the emission inventory that listed dairies as number one, as a source for VOCs. And this particular table within this book shows a cow number down here in this table, along with elephants, horses, goats, and sheep, saying that a cow produces 200 grams of methane per day. And methane, by the way, is not smoke forming. It's a greenhouse gas. It has nothing to do with smoke. But this is the number that they used in order to establish the emission inventory for smoke forming gases in the San Joaquin Valley. And I will now share with you the worksheet that really outlines where that number came from. And so we did a lot of research, and what we found in our research, measuring smoke-forming gases from dry cows, lactating cows, calves, from their manure, from feed, and from all the other sources of potentially smoke-forming gases on dairies, was something surprising. What we found and published is that the lagoons are not the number one source of these smoke-forming volatile organic compounds, but the lagoon is the smallest of all sources on a dairy. Why? Because these compounds are diluted with water. And these compounds, they have a high affinity to stay in the water, and they prefer staying in the water to going into the air. So the lagoon is not the major source, but the smallest source. It's followed by fresh manure, but by far the number one source of these gases is not related to manure. It's fermented feed. It's silage. So we have found that it's not the manure, it's not the animals, but it is fermented feed before it goes into the cow that we want to reduce as an emission source. We want to reduce it as an emission, as a loss source for several reasons. One of them is obvious. We don't want it to go into the air. But the other one is, which dairyman would like for 20% of the feed, dry matter, to get lost into the air? Nobody wants that. So we're trying to find a way to keep that dry matter in the pile as opposed to going off into the air. And we're making progress. This is what a typical pile looks like in California. I'm not suggesting that anybody should stand where this guy is staying here because of the danger for it to collapse. But by having these very large faces, we have a very large area where these compounds can go off. And they do go off. And we're losing feed value, and we are also having an issue with respect to environmental quality. So the reason why I'm telling you this story is because it is a case study that exemplifies, first of all, that you shouldn't believe everything you hear just because it comes from an official source. Secondly, that it is important to have science-based regulation, because if nobody has ever measured it before, the chances are the data is not very good. So, with that, I'm shifting my focus from regional air quality and what happened in California. By the way, things are really improving now, okay? The air regulatory agencies are now really looking at science. I'm now shifting from the regional California perspective to an international perspective and a United Nations FAO report that most or all of you are familiar with. It was titled Livestock's Long Shadow, and it has received a lot of attention globally. It was published by the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO. And what it said in its executive summary, and that's really what I took aim at, was that the livestock sector is a major player responsible for 18% of greenhouse gas emissions, measured as CO2 equivalents. This is a higher share than transportation. So what this United Nations FAO said was that livestock produces more greenhouse gases, causing climate change, than all transportation globally. So livestock produces more than all cars, trucks, trains, planes, ships in the world combined. Well, a similar experience to what I just described happening to me in California now happened globally, with the big difference that everybody picked up on that portion of this Livestock's Long Shadow report. Have you heard that San Francisco is now Meatless Monday? Have you seen the Toyota Prius advertisement comparing a Prius to a sheep and which one is greener? Or have you seen all these different things? I mean, they are all over the world media. I took this photo here in Sweden. It shows 3 burgers. It shows a tofu burger, a turkey burger, and a beef burger. This wouldn't be special if there weren't these blue bubbles associated to the burgers. And the blue bubbles are the carbon footprint of these burgers. So if you are Swedish and you go to eat a burger, the price might not be the only selection criteria, but the carbon footprint might be another one. And if you think this is just a question that is raised in Sweden, you're wrong. It is something that's happening right here, right now. So looking away, saying, we don't care about this, we don't believe in this, and so on, no longer cuts it. So I will spend a very few minutes talking about climate change, talking about greenhouse gases, talking about livestock's contribution to it, but just to really set the stage. The question of climate change is not a question whether or not it's happening. It has always happened. It has always heated up and cooled down throughout world history. This is not a question whether that happens. The question that some people dispute is whether humans have part of it, whether they are partly to be blamed to climate change. That's the question that scientists have. The majority of scientists would say yes, humans have a contribution, but some scientists say no, humans are not really to be blamed. What you see here is something that we observe throughout the world, and that is that there are certain regions in the world, and I can see this on my computer every day, where we do see changes occurring. That's true for both the North and South Pole. It's also true for places like the tundra in Siberia, where all of a sudden that soil is warming up, releasing large quantities of methane gas, which I can see from certain satellites with certain filters. I see things that haven't happened 10, 20, 30 years ago. Okay, we do see regional change happening. The question is, why is it happening? What is the greenhouse effect? This is the greenhouse effect, where the sun radiates down solar beams to the Earth's surface, they bounce back off, and normally they would go right back into space, but because of greenhouse gases, these solar beams get trapped by these molecules. Carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide are the most important ones. So these molecules, basically, when they're hit by a solar beam, they trap the heat. They trap the heat similar to let's say, a styrofoam cup or a China cup or a Starbucks $20 cup. Okay, that keeps your coffee warm. I always use that analogy for my students because it makes sense. If you want to put your coffee into a container, you can put it in a styrofoam cup and it won't stay warm very long, or into a China cup, it will stay warm longer, or into a Starbucks $20 insulated cup, and it will stay hot for a long time. The same is true for these 3 molecules. Whoa, what did I do now? Press the wrong button. That will teach me. So CO2 is similar to the styrofoam cup. It traps the heat like the other 2 molecules, but it cools down quickly. Methane traps the heat 20 times better than CO2. And nitrous oxide traps the heat 300 times better than CO2. So that's like the Starbucks $20 insulated cup here. This thing, nitrous oxide. Methane is like the China cup, and this is the styrofoam cup. The term for this phenomenon is the global warming potential of these molecules. They differ. Now, livestock systems produce all three of these greenhouse gases. Methane is most related to ruminant livestock, but also to waste in general. When you store waste, you will produce methane. And nitrous oxide is in general associated with nitrogen applied to soils. Every time you put chemical fertilizers or animal manure in the ground, microbes will work on that, and some of that will go off as nitrous oxide. So, as I said, there are scientists who debate the human contribution to climate change, but those who don't debate it, who say, yes, humans have a contribution to climate change, and also the EPA, say the number one contribution of humans to climate change is through use of fossil fuel, and I'll explain that real quick. On this slide, it shows two panels. The bottom panel here shows the years 1750 to 2000. The blue line in this bottom panel shows when within the last 250 years fossil fuel was used. Fossil fuel being oil, gas, and coal. Within the last 250 years, nothing happened for the longest time, and then starting 1950, with the use of automobiles, we saw a dramatic increase in the use of fossil fuel. So oil and coal and gas being taken out of the ground that had been in there for hundreds of millions of years. And that fossil fuel was taken out of the ground and put where? It was put into the atmosphere. So something that accumulated in the ground for hundreds of millions of years was taken out of the ground and burned and put into the atmosphere, where it is now. And every time the sun comes in, it hits those molecules and they trap heat. Those people who believe in human-caused climate change contributions, that's what they're referring to. With the amount of fossil fuel being used, we also see concurrently that CO2 concentration is going up. That's what EPA and most of the scientists who are in favor of climate change, human contributions, explain it as. That's how they explain it. If you ask the EPA, in 2009 they put together their emission inventory, and it shows on the x-axis here the years 1990 to 2007. On the y-axis, the total amount of greenhouse gases produced in the United States. This is the official emission inventory for greenhouse gases. And it shows that the vast majority of greenhouse gases is associated with transportation, energy production, and use. That's this orange area. This gray area is of interest to you because this is the contribution of agriculture to total greenhouse gases. According to EPA, it's 5.8% of all greenhouse gases in the United States that's caused by agriculture. That's animal and plant agriculture, both combined. According to EPA, half of that is animal agriculture, so around 3%, a little bit over 3%, according to EPA, is animal agriculture, and that's all species. So the question now is, the United Nations FAO says it's 18%, and livestock produces more greenhouse gases than transportation, and our EPA in the United States says, no, it's 3-point-something%, and transportation is 26%. And energy production and use is 31%. So how come that there are such huge differences? By the way, our research done on campus seconds the EPA view. We find that livestock contributes around 3.4% of all greenhouse gases in the United States. So why this difference between 18% and 3.4%, and why, in our opinion, is it inappropriate to compare livestock to transportation? In order to explain that, I want to show you a couple of slides taken from Livestock's Long Shadow, from this United Nations FAO report. These are very important slides. The first one is, the first one shows where in the world we have livestock. The areas in red are the hotspots. You might think of places like the Midwest or California as places with a lot of livestock, but we have nothing compared to India or China. That's really where the livestock is. They have dozens of times more livestock than we do here. Of course, much less efficient livestock, but way more. Of course, Uruguay, Argentina, Brazil, and so on has a lot of livestock too. What's much more important than this slide is this slide. And this slide shows where in the world we have arable land. Where in the world do we have land that can be used to grow crops or animals? The areas in color are the only areas in the world that can be used to produce human food. We've heard earlier today that in about 30 years, we need to increase the amount of food produced by around 70%. We are very likely to have a doubling demand of animal protein within the next 30 years. It's not because we all eat 2 burgers a day, but that's because India and China has more disposable income. And because of that, their demand for animal protein is exploding. I've been there 3 times, and I can tell you it is really true that the consumption there is changing rapidly. The question then is, if the land is so limited on which we can grow plants and animals, and we need twice as much food then in 30 years than we do today, how do we produce that food? How do we produce that food without being able to increase the resources where we grow it on? That's the question. According to the United Nations FAO, and that was really the main reason why they wrote their Livestock Storm Shadow report, according to the United Nations FAO, the main contribution of livestock to climate change, in their opinion, is deforestation. Why? Because if you take down trees, you take down a sink for greenhouse gases, because trees take on CO2 and give off oxygen. So, in countries like Brazil or Paraguay, where I used to live for 9 months, I can tell you there's a lot of deforestation going on. Why? Because the owners of that land are charged tax every year for owning their land. If they just grow natural forests and they have to pay tax every year, then they have no revenue stream coming in while they have to pay tax going out. And because of that, many of them decided, you know what, I will not leave that forest on my land. I better change that land use practice and grow soy or cattle. And that's why we see what we see, which is pretty dramatic deforestation in parts of South America. If you look at the United States, do we see any red spots here? No, we don't. Why? Because that change in land use practice has occurred 200 years ago in this country. But today there's a net increase in forest land. We have no livestock-associated land use change in this country here. In fact, we are becoming more intensive in the way we produce. Now comes the explanation as to why the comparison of livestock and transportation that was used by the United Nations FAO is flawed. The first slide here shows how the carbon footprint of any source is assessed. So basically you look at every activity that's associated with the production of whatever you're looking at. For example, if you want to know what's the carbon footprint of a gallon of milk, you need to look at what's the carbon footprint of the feed that's produced to feed the animals and their emissions, belching and all that. The manure the animals produce that is then incorporated into the soil, the crops that are grown, and so on. To drive it home, if somebody asks you what the carbon footprint is to go from your hometown to come here, then of course it's not just the kerosene that has been burned for you to fly from A to B, but it's also the resources that went into building that plane and the rubber and the airport and all the stuff related with you coming here is part of establishing the carbon footprint. And it's not just the burning of the gas to get you here. Why is that important? That is important because that's where the cause of the flaw lies. So if you just look at the burning of gas, let's say from getting to A to B in a car, then that would be direct emission, just looking at the direct emission of burning gas. In the case of a cow or a steer or a pig, let's stay with ruminants now, cows and steers, for example, you have the animal belching out methane, releasing manure, and that manure also produces methane and nitrous oxide. If you only establish how much greenhouse gases come from belching and the manure, then that's only looking at the direct emissions. What one should do is a true life cycle assessment that also looks at the land where the animals graze on or where the feed comes from, indirect emissions like fertilizer, herbicides, pesticides, and so on. So it's much more comprehensive and really looks into all the aspects of livestock production. And this is a true life cycle assessment. That's the way it should be done. Any kind of life cycle assessment should be done like this. The problem here is this. The United Nations FAO, when they compared livestock to transportation, they did this for livestock. They looked at every aspect of livestock production. That's the way it should be done. But when they looked at transportation, they only looked at what is the impact of burning gas. They didn't look at what's the impact of getting the gas, getting the oil out of the ground in Saudi Arabia, shipping it to Texas, refining it, getting it to gas stations, building trucks, trains, planes, ships, all the steel and all that stuff that goes into that, building the roads and so on. They didn't look at the total life cycle for transportation, but only for livestock. And because of that, they did a classical apples to oranges comparison. They looked at the very holistic assessment on the one hand versus just one portion on the other hand. Now, of course, pointing this out alone is not enough. NCBA funded a study in my lab, and two of my graduate students and I authored this paper, Clearing the Air: Livestock's Contribution to Climate Change. And we published it in 2009. And then I presented this at the American Chemical Society in San Francisco, and a journalist from the Associated Press was in attendance. So basically what we showed, first of all, was that the United Nations 18% number, this global number, first of all, I don't think it's very useful because it does not separate different species of livestock out, cattle versus pigs versus poultry and so on, and it's a global number. But is the United States similar to Brazil or to Ethiopia? I don't think so. So what does a global number really do? If it doesn't apply to the United States or to Brazil or to Ethiopia, if it doesn't separate out different species, then it does very little. I think actually it's a number that should have never been put out. What is very clear is that there are huge differences between US estimates and this global estimate, and I will now tell you why. First of all, in developed countries like this one, like the US, the livestock industry is dwarfed by other sectors of society, like transportation, energy production, and use, because we have so much more cars and so on, compared to many other countries. In developing countries, and I've lived in several, we have way more livestock than people. For example, in Paraguay, we have twice as many cattle than we have people. And we are clear-cutting forests. In a country like Paraguay, livestock might make up as much as 50% of the total carbon portfolio. In a country like Ethiopia, it might be as much as 90%. I just give you an example here, greenhouse gases by regions. And this comes from the United Nations FAO. On the left side, you see the years 1990 to 2020, on the right side as well. But in the one case, you see it for developing countries of the world, and on the right side for developed countries of the world. So these are third world countries, and these are countries like the United States and Europe. So what we see is a pretty dramatic increase in greenhouse gases in the third world. Whereas in the first world, or in developed countries, we see a plateauing of greenhouse gases at a low level. Why? Because we are so much more efficient in these countries, in these developed countries. And that's one of the main reasons why a global average doesn't really do a thing. So it shows on the x-axis different commodities here, ruminant meat, dairy, and non-ruminant meat. On the y-axis, the total amount of greenhouse gas per dollar of output. And if you look at the different colors, the left one is blue. In blue is the US. In red, it's the European Union. In green is Brazil. Look at these emission the emission intensity differences across regions. And the reason why we have these differences in emission intensity, how much emission is produced per unit of production, the reason for that is that we are so efficient in a country like the United States, whereas in a country like Brazil, they are still clear-cutting, taking trees off, and producing, for example, cattle over much longer periods of time. Our feedlot steers go to slaughter at 14 months of age. A country like Brazil or Paraguay, it takes 3 years or longer to finish them. According even to Livestock's Long Shadow, this United Nations FAO report, intensification provides large opportunities for climate change mitigation. So what they are saying is the more intensive you are, the less resources you need per unit of production. And I'll give you an example for that. The average production of milk in California is approximately 20,000 pounds per cow per year. You know what the average cow in Mexico produces? 4,000 pounds. It takes 5 Mexican cows to produce the same amount of milk as 1 California happy cow. I just had to bring that in. I just had to. So, why is this important? It is so important because these 5 cows on the one side of the border produce, of course, way more manure and way more enteric gases and so on compared to that one cow on the other side of the water. Intensification has everything to do with environmental impact. The public in this country doesn't want to hear this, and they don't know this. They think the smaller you get and the more you turn them out on pasture and so on, the better it is for the environment. I have nothing against pasture production, but I can tell you the opposite is true. Animals on pasture, you cannot control what happens to their manure. It goes wherever it goes. If you have intensive production, you can collect the manure, you can do something with it. For example, put it in a digester. And you are certainly more efficient with the way you produce. There's no doubt about that part. I want to give you those numbers here just for your information purposes. These are the official EPA numbers for the different sources in the United States. Total transportation accounts for 26%. Electricity production and use, 31%. Livestock, they say between 3 and 3.4%. Livestock's long shadow is an international number, not representative for the US. This number includes deforestation and other issues. The biggest problem is they have used an apples and oranges comparisons to compare livestock to transportation. And the UN, FAO, decided to follow up. And what they did was they are in the process of writing species-specific new reports. The first one came out for the dairy sector, and it shows the different regions in the world on the x-axis and the total amount of greenhouse gases on the y-axis. And it shows the first one, North America, as being the smallest greenhouse gas source across all regions in the world for the dairy sector. Now, North America is obviously not just the US. This is US and Mexico. If you would cancel out Mexico and look at the US, you would find a column that's about half the size it is here. What this really shows you is that we are a model for the rest of the world with respect to producing nutritious food while minimizing our environmental impact. That is a message totally misunderstood by the public. And we are doing an awful job educating the public. An awful job. We collectively. The United Nations FAO and Henning Steinfeld, I met with him at the National Academy of Sciences recently. They're now writing a new article, and that article is called Shrinking the Shadow. There it is. His key message is this one. There. Intensification is the key to mitigation. And that is a total departure from what I had seen in the past.